Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. Temple, Texas, January 4th, 2019, about 3:00 a.m. Two friends, Jenna Scott, 28, and Michael Swearingen, 32, go quiet. Calls that normally get a sleepy text back roll straight to voicemail. Within minutes, a welfare check begins to look less like a misunderstanding and more like a cross-state crime. By late morning, detectives have the names, the address in Temple, and a tight window to work. Last verified contact just after 3. Nothing credible from either phone after that. The first pass is procedural. Patrol documents the residence from the outside, notes vehicles accounted for, and logs when family last saw and spoke to Jenna and Michael. No forced entry reported, no argument heard by neighbors. The anomaly that does matter is absence. The home security setup isn't yielding video. That missing digital witness narrows options and elevates concern. When adults with routines go dark at the exact same time, investigators treat it as a clock problem. What happened between Halero 300 and sunrise? Within minutes becomes a mandate. Supervisors activate a missing persons protocol and push a quick scan of financials, health checks, and device status through the usual channels. Friends are canvassed for last messages. Co-workers are contacted to confirm no early morning outreach. The same answer repeats. Nothing since just after 3. Negative evidence, no verified two-way activity starts to anchor the case more firmly than any single tip. By the weekend, the search footprint widens along I-35. The goal is simple: find the people or find what they were riding in. Monday, January 7th delivers the first hard break. A gray Hyundai Genesis linked to the pair is located in East Austin. No occupants, no disturbance in public view, no helpful dash footage. Officers preserve the car, document its position relative to nearby businesses, and cue a canvas for cameras that might have caught the arrival or a transfer to another vehicle. In towns like Temple, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. But in this moment, detectives avoid labels and follow the paper and the physics. Who could have placed that car there and when? Interagency coordination ramps. The car's location shifts attention south while case agents keep Temple as the origin point. Cell site requests are logged, camera pulls are scheduled, timelines get a second and third pass. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem, one investigator notes, meaning the neatness might reflect what's missing as much as what's present. 9 days after the last contact, Tuesday, January 15th, the search reaches rural Oklahoma. A clandestine burial site near Clearview, Okfuskee County, is located and secured. 2 bodies are recovered. Identification proceeds in medical custody. That recovery will not be re-narrated later. Its value here is chronological. It closes the initial search and moves the investigation from open ground to the controlled light of the autopsy suite. The opening sequence ends with 3 fixed points. Halero 3 last verified activity in Temple. January 7th, vehicle recovery in East Austin. January 15th, recovery of remains near Clearview. Everything that follows, scene work, digital paths, interviews, receipts, will be tested against those stamps. Early theories are kept off the record. The case advances on what can be logged, measured, and later admitted. From open ground to controlled light, the case moves off the landscape and onto stainless steel. At first contact, the work is administrative on purpose. Remains arrive under seal, time-stamped and photographed before the bags are opened. Technicians verify tag numbers against the transport manifest. Each seal is logged, cut, and preserved in evidence envelopes. Chain of custody signatures are captured at every handoff: intake desk, property clerk, autopsy suite, because any weak link will be exploited later. This is how a field discovery becomes a courtroom exhibit. The medical team begins with identifiers. Clothing and bindings, if present, are photographed in situ, removed, dried, and packaged separately. Personal items are inventoried on a property sheet with line numbers for cross-reference. Fingerprints are taken when feasible. Dental charting is photographed. Radiographs are captured to locate foreign material and to document skeletal injury before soft tissue dissection. And swabs are collected from the mouth and under nails for DNA comparison. Each action is routine, but routine is the point. A predictable process that produces reliable facts. Cause and manner are approached in layers, never guessed. For Jenna Scott, 28, external survey notes patterned abrasions on the lower face and neck consistent with adhesive contact. Ribs show fractures documented by X-ray and confirmed on sectioning. No one infers motive from morphology. The working interpretation, later presented in court, is homicidal violence, a conclusion supported by the injury pattern and the absence of disease or accident indicators. For Michael Swearingen, 32, the neck exam records soft tissue hemorrhage. The sclera show petechial changes. Strap muscles reveal focal bleeding. The findings track to strangulation as the cause of death. Manner is homicide. Those words are used sparingly, written only after the internal exam supports the external record. Timing matters. The pathologist anchors postmortem interval estimates to temperature, insect activity if present, and tissue condition. The estimates are expressed as ranges, not absolutes, and they are tied to the last verified contact and subsequent weather data. When the narrative is played back later in court, these ranges must align with call logs, travel times, and retail receipts. If the numbers don't agree, the theory moves, not the clock. Trace tells a second story. Adhesive residue collected from Jenna's skin is preserved for potential brand comparison. Fibers recovered from tape edges and clothing are mounted on slides and photographed with scale, then sealed for later comparison against items seized by warrant. Microsoil is lifted from footwear and packed for a geologist to compare with the composition at the burial location. None of this proves who did what, but it tightens the map. Which items could have touched which surfaces and when. Toxicology screens are ordered as a matter of course. Anticoagulants, sedatives, stimulants, anything that could impair or mask struggle are tested. Results are read cautiously. Absence of a compound is data, not an exoneration of force. If medications consistent with a prescription appear, they are noted but not dramatized. The question is narrow. Do the chemical findings challenge or support the mechanical findings of restraint and asphyxia? The team documents injury sequencing, blunt force to the rib cage, then airway compromise, or the reverse. The sequence matters for reconstruction because it will later be tested against any statement that tries to minimize intent. If a witness claims a sudden collapse, the rib pattern and tape residue argue otherwise. If a narrative suggests a fall, the distribution and symmetry of injuries will either resist or accept that claim. The morgue is not just finding cause, it's constraining stories. Everything feeds forward. Samples are split where possible, one for state testing, one held for independent defense review, to preempt later challenges. Photographs include overview, mid-range, and macro images with color and metric scales, timestamps visible on the frame. The report language stays clinical and short. Jurors don't need poetry, they need structure, injury, mechanism, certainty level. There's space here, briefly, for perspective. In towns like Temple, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. But the autopsy suite can't measure grief. It can measure hemorrhage, adhesive patterns, and the physics of a closed airway. That is the value it brings to a case that will soon hinge on competing timelines and selective memory. A final integrity check closes the session. Evidence bags are resealed with new numbers. The chain of custody log is updated. Copies of the autopsy report are routed to investigators and the prosecutor with embargoed distribution. Nothing about this chapter reveals who is responsible. That's not the morgue's mandate. The mandate is to set hard edges. Jenna Scott, homicidal violence with restraint indicators. Michael Swearingen, strangulation. Those edges will shape every interview, every carrier record, and every receipt that follows. With medical facts codified, investigators return to the rooms, the car, and the cameras, because the scenes now have to match the bodies. The first indoor sweep happens under warrant at a residence in Killeen, identified in affidavits as a possible interior site. Technicians start with what can be proven: condition of doors and windows, latch positions, damage or lack of it, and the order in which rooms are documented. Door hardware is photographed with scale. Hinges and strike plates are checked for deformation. Nothing is called forced unless the metal shows it. Floors and common pathways are taped off for trace collection. Any latent prints are dusted, lifted, and logged with precise locations. Not just a room name, but surface and height from the floor, so later testimony can be exact. Swabs target high-touch areas: door pulls, light switches, a stair rail. If a luminol decision is made, it's recorded with the reason and the result. not dramatized. Back in Temple, the home tied to Jenna Scott is handled as a parallel administrative scene. Investigators document the absence of footage from a previously installed system, timestamps, model numbers if available, the state of any wiring or mounts. It's written simply as an absence, not a conclusion. A missing digital witness makes everything else work harder. Neighbors are contacted to confirm whether any doorbell cameras or driveway systems were active during the window when the phones went quiet. Where residents agree to releases, officers secure copies and chain of custody forms, just like physical evidence. The car is where the story advances. The gray Hyundai Genesis is impounded from East Austin with position photos from multiple angles before it moves an inch. Its orientation to the curb, the proximity to cameras, the state of the ignition and gear selector, and the absence of occupants are all logged. Exterior handles and trunk points are swabbed for touch DNA. The steering wheel, gear knob, and seat controls are prioritized for latent prints. Floor mats are removed onto clean paper to collect micro debris. Any soil is bagged for comparison to known locations later. If the odometer reading is reliable, mileage is matched against the travel window. Service stickers and fuel receipts are photographed to anchor the car's recent life. Canvassing along the East Austin corridor is methodical. Officers map businesses and residences with cameras that might face the curb line. Managers are asked for retention policies and exact camera clocks. Courts care about whether a clip is 2 minutes fast or 9 minutes slow. Where a clip brackets the car's arrival or departure, investigators note the bounding times even if the plate itself is not legible. A second pass verifies that downloads match what's stated on the request forms. Any gap is written into the log, so there's no surprise on the stand. Itemized traces begin to triangulate with autopsy facts from the last chapter. Adhesive residue recovered from the bodies is preserved for potential comparison to tape seized by warrant. Fibers lifted from seats or floor mats are preserved to see whether they align with household textiles from the Killeen residence. Soil from the car's underbody is reserved for a geologic match to the burial environment. These are working links until a lab report says otherwise, but they give the case direction without naming anyone responsible. On the human side, the tone stays measured. Families are told what can be said. The car has been recovered and is being processed. Leads are developing. Nothing is announced until a lab signs it. In towns like Temple, murders aren't just crimes, they tear at the fabric of a quiet community. But restraint in public updates protects the record and the families at the same time. The work now is to make the rooms, the car, and the camera clocks agree with the body findings. If they do, the next step is to test statements against those fixed points. With the rooms documented and the car preserved, the clocks shift to the towers and the ledgers. Carrier records arrive under court order. Analysts parse call detail logs and the associated cell site sectors, correcting for tower maintenance notes and sector azimuth so the map is a reconstruction, not guesswork. The first task is narrow. Anchor the last verified activity from Jenna Scott and Michael Swearingen near 3 o'clock a.m., January 4, 2019, then test everything that moves after that against the fixed points already established. Within minutes of pulling the data, a consistent pattern starts to appear. Victim devices show no verified two-way activity after the early morning window, while other numbers of interest continue to hand off between sectors. Timestamps and sectors are joined to the road grid used in Central Texas. The path that matters most in this crime is the corridor that links Temple to Killeen and then south toward Austin. Sector changes and timing align with a vehicle speed progression. There is no claim of GPS or app-level precision, only the distances and orientations the towers can support. Where the model gets tight is around East Austin. Camera canvassing from Chapter 3 supplies bracketing times for the gray Hyundai Genesis. Investigators sync business DVR clocks against an official reference, so a 3 minutes fast camera can still serve as a reliable boundary. Even if a plate is unreadable, the arrival and any later movement can be framed between two corrected timestamps. The next question is simple. Does any device linked through the investigation appear to break north after the Austin sequence? Carrier logs and tower placements outside Texas are requested through the same legal process. The response shows handoffs that match a route toward Henrietta, Oklahoma, then into Okfuskee County. At each hop, the team asks whether the times are plausible given speed limits and fuel stops, not whether the pattern looks right. When analysts say a path is consistent, they mean it meets timing and sector constraints without overclaiming precision. Financial records add a second axis. Subpoenaed bank data show a transaction at a Walmart in Henrietta later that same day. Store personnel authenticate the receipt and confirm video retention. On-screen overlays are checked against store clocks, then against the bank timestamp. Items on the receipt include a shovel, a utility knife, clothing, and 2 pairs of shoes. The shovel's barcode in the record matches the SKU on the receipt. All of this is labeled working until the admissibility rulings, then admitted where the court allows. The value is not in drama but in sequence. If a purchase occurs after the victims go dark and before the burial site is located, that purchase sits at the center of planning or concealment. Back in Texas, the East 12th Street camera set provides a clean test. If the Hyundai arrives inside a bracketed window, cell site arcs for phones moving with it should intersect Austin area sectors within the same window. If the car does not leave on camera, but a relevant device migrates north later that night, the data suggest a transfer. Investigators avoid speculation and do the join by arithmetic. Device sector handoffs, camera windows, reasonable travel time between curbside and interstate on-ramps. Where the math fails, the theory moves. Analysts also chart dark intervals, periods when victim devices are inactive or only emit background network chatter. Those intervals matter when statements later claim continued contact. If a message appears on a victim's account after 300 a.m., Jan 4, the question becomes who had physical access to the device at that moment. That's a testable question, not a narrative flourish. Digital and financial records together produce a ladder. Temple, Killeen, East Austin, car bracketed by cameras. Henrietta, OK, receipt and video. OK, Fusky County, subsequent sectors. Each rung is independently sourced. Carriers, cameras, bank logs, store video. Each step is reviewed for clock error and overclaim risk. In towns built on routine, this is how investigators measure truth. A phone sector change should agree with a camera's clock. A receipt should land where the towers say a device stood. If they agree, interviews will have to meet the same standard. Next, those interviews arrive, statements compared line by line to the paths you've just heard. By the time analysts finish syncing towers and receipts, detectives move to controlled conversations. The goal is narrow: capture exact language, not impressions, and test every claim against the clocks already established. Interviews begin with those closest to Jenna Scott and Michael Swearingen, then widen to people with access to the homes, the car, and the time window. Each statement is recorded, transcribed, and tagged with a reliability note: what can be tested now, what requires lab work, and what is opinion. Family and friends provide the baseline. They confirm routines, health, and recent concerns, but they also lock in the last legitimate voice and text timestamps around 3 o'clock a.m. Their information is useful because it limits the number of plausible explanations for silence. No one describes voluntary travel plans north. No one reports a loan of the Hyundai Genesis to anyone outside the immediate circle. That matters when an abandoned car turns up miles away. Statements about permission or casual use don't match how the car was actually handled. Temple and Killeen interviews shift to access and opportunity. Detectives document who had keys, who knew alarm codes, and who had a path into the Killeen residence identified in affidavits as a possible interior site. People are asked for exact whereabouts during the early hours of January 4th and for the rest of that long weekend. Alibis are trimmed down to receipts, surveillance, and device location history that survives legal scrutiny. Vague, at-home, asleep answers are not dismissed, but they are flagged as uncorroborated until something external supports them. The most consequential account comes from a cooperating witness who later pleads guilty to tampering with a human corpse. Her timeline places both victims alive inside the Killeen home late January 3rd, notes a separation into different rooms, and describes a violent sequence followed by transport. Investigators do not accept the narrative on faith. They test it against independent anchors. First, does the sequence allow the Hyundai to appear in East Austin inside the bracketed camera window? Yes, the described travel window is compatible with the corrected DVR times from nearby businesses. Second, Does the story account for the northbound movement toward Henrietta, Oklahoma within the same day? It does. Her route description and the bank timestamp for the Walmart purchase align within a plausible travel span. Third, does the account explain the recovered restraint indicators and asphyxia findings? The description of how the victims were overpowered and restrained is consistent with the autopsy language already on the record. Where the cooperating witness's story resists easy testing, detectives push for detail. What vehicle was used when the Hyundai was left in East Austin? Which road segments were taken to cross the Red River? Who handled which items at the Henrietta stop, and which payment method was used? The witness identifies store layout and recalls moving through hardware and apparel sections. Under follow-up, she recognizes the shovel type when shown a lawful photo of a similar model. Her precision improves when grounded in receipts and video stills. The interview team avoids leading questions and marks any subsequent revisions as amendments, not erasures, so a jury can see the progression. Separate statements from acquaintances are compared side by side with the same discipline. If someone insists the victims texted later that morning, investigators match the claim against the dark interval on the victim's devices. If a person reports seeing the Hyundai after the East Austin window, the team requests their phone records and nearby cameras to validate the sighting. When memory conflicts with data, the data is used first. When two data sources conflict, the more objective clock is chosen: carrier time over wall clocks, bank servers over handwritten notes. As the interviews mature, a coherent sequence forms without guessing motive. The cooperating witness provides an interior description and transport path. Cell site and camera brackets provide location bounds. The receipt and video verify procurement. And the autopsy explains the injury pattern. Taken together, the statements that survive testing point toward a coordinated series of acts that meet the legal elements of capital murder of multiple persons: identity, act, and aggravating circumstance without theatrical language. It's a line-by-line build, and it's designed to hold in court. Next comes the paper that shows intent and concealment in real time. Purchase records, travel charges, and surveillance that prosecutors will braid into a theory the jury can follow. With clocks, receipts, and statements aligned, the record moves from interview rooms to a courtroom in Belton, Texas. Jury selection centers on two promises: decide only on admitted evidence, follow the law on capital murder of multiple persons. The prosecution's opening is mechanical by design. They present the route as a ladder: Temple to Killeen to East Austin to Henrietta to rural Okfuskee County. Then tell the panel they'll show how each rung is supported by a different system clock. The defense reserves broad objections and attacks reliability in advance. Camera clocks drift, cell towers generalize, recollections shift. The judge instructs the jury that arguments aren't evidence. Admissibility rulings control what the jury hears. The medical examiner testifies first. Cause and manner are delivered without speculation. Homicidal violence for Jenna Scott. Strangulation for Michael Swearingen. Photos are limited to what's necessary to explain injury mechanics. Next come the digital analysts. They explain call detail records and cell site sectors in plain language. No GPS claims, no app traces. Just the way devices hand off between towers and how that handoff matches a vehicle's plausible movement window. They acknowledge limitations and show how camera clocks were corrected, so a 3-minute drift doesn't distort an arrival bracket. The East Austin vehicle processing is introduced through chain of custody. Jurors see where the gray Hyundai Genesis sat relative to cameras, how touch DNA and latent print swabs were prioritized, and how micro debris and soil were preserved for later comparison. The point isn't drama, it's continuity. Every handoff, every seal, every lab report number. Then the financial records arrive. A Henrietta Walmart manager authenticates the receipt and video. Item names and barcodes line up with the bank timestamp. The purchase list, shovel, utility knife, clothing, shoes, is placed on a timeline anchored by the carrier data and the corrected DVR overlays. The cooperating witness, who previously pled guilty to tampering with a human corpse, testifies under oath. Direct examination is strict. She marks locations on maps, recounts the separation of the victims, describes transport, and acknowledges moving the Hyundai to East Austin. When her description is tested against the technical record, the camera window in Austin, the route north, and the Henrietta stop, the overlaps are clear. On cross, the defense highlights her plea and the incentive to cooperate. The state replies that her story fails without independent clocks. The clocks match. Defense themes emphasize alternative interpretations. Could cell site arcs be imprecise? Yes, analysts already said so. Could camera drift skew timing? Only if uncorrected. Corrections were shown. Could the purchase have been unrelated? The response is the sequence. Victim silent after 3 o'clock a.m. Procurement later that day. Burial located in the corridor that follows. The court reminds jurors to weigh credibility, not personal theories. Closing arguments keep the latter structure. The state argues that independent systems, phones, cameras, bank servers, agree on the who, where, and when of a coordinated crime involving 2 homicides in close proximity. The defense asks the jury to find reasonable doubt in technical limits and witness motives. The judge charges the jury on capital murder of multiple persons and on how to evaluate circumstantial evidence that interlocks across sources. Deliberations move efficiently. The jury returns a guilty verdict on capital murder. The punishment phase addresses aggravating factors and mitigation. After hearing the evidence permitted by law, the panel answers the special issues, resulting in a sentence of death. Post-verdict, the court memorializes the judgment. Automatic review and appellate procedures initiate. As of September 7, 2025, the conviction and sentence stand while appeals proceed in the ordinary course. Next, we'll close the arc with a single consistent ending line and a YouTube-safe reflection on why method, not spectacle, protects families and the record. With interagency custody stabilized and the record sealed for review, the final phase began where every serious crime ends or survives, inside a courtroom, under the rules of evidence. The bridge from investigation to verdict ran through a narrow gate, pre-trial admissibility. What came through that gate shaped everything the jury would be allowed to weigh. The defense opened with suppression motions aimed at the spine of the chronology. They challenged the carrier call detail records and corresponding cell site maps as too coarse for precise travel claims. They questioned time drift on third-party cameras in East Austin. They sought limits on a cooperating witness whose plea to tampering might influence her memory. And because the defendant had previously escaped custody in 2019, they argued against any mention of that event in front of jurors to avoid prejudice, reserving it for custody and risk determinations outside the panel's view. The state answered each point with procedure, not rhetoric. Analysts authenticated the carrier records through business records custodians. Technicians documented and corrected camera clocks. Witness interviews were recorded and transcribed with amendments marked. The court admitted the technical evidence for what it could show and nothing more, reminding everyone that cell site sectors suggest movement windows, not GPS dots. The next set of motions focused on statements. The defendant elected to represent himself for significant portions of the proceedings, a choice that required the court to balance autonomy with order. Standby counsel remained available. The judge read the necessary warnings. The record reflected that the decision was knowing and voluntary. When the defendant later addressed jurors in the punishment phase and acknowledged post-offense conduct, those words entered the transcript like any other testimony, subject to the same scrutiny and the same law. Pretrial challenges asked the court to cabin the scope, what the jury could hear about those admissions and what context would be allowed. Rulings followed a simple line: relevance, reliability, and the right to cross-examine. Bail was not the fight here. Flight risk had already been established years earlier. The court kept a steady posture: secure transport, layered restraints out of the jury's sightline, and no non-essential stops. Those choices didn't try the facts. They protected the process. Families sat through it all, stoic, attentive, sometimes looking toward the clock on the back wall because time in a courtroom has a different weight. Once the admissibility gates closed, trial built itself like scaffolding, one structural beam at a time. The medical examiner explained injuries and mechanisms without adjectives. Cause and manner were stated plainly, each finding aligned with the timeline already anchored by digital silence in the early morning and confirmed movement north later that day. The state's device analysts followed with carrier logs and sector maps, translating radio frequency handoffs into understandable travel windows. They said what could be said and stopped where the science ends. Camera technicians testified to the East Austin bracket and how the Hyundai Genesis came into and out of view. They showed the clock correction worksheet so that minute level adjustments were transparent. A records custodian from the Henrietta retailer authenticated the receipt and corresponding video. Item descriptions matched purchase barcodes and a bank timestamp, which matched what the jurors had already seen from phone and camera minutes. Chain of custody witnesses explained the car processing sequence: photographs, latent print lifts, trace collection, bagging, sealing, and lab intake. The point wasn't spectacle, it was continuity. Each handoff had a name, a time, and a signature. The cooperating witness, already convicted of tampering, placed key movements and actions into that framework. Her route description fit the corrected camera times. Her recollection of items lined up with the retail list. Cross-examination pressed incentives and memory drift. Jurors watched for seams. The court's limiting instructions emphasized that corroboration, not character, must do the heavy lifting. In this room, methods matter more than personalities. The defense theory emphasized uncertainty as reasonable doubt. Cell site arcs, they argued, were too broad. Camera drift was too slippery. A witness with a plea could bend facts to survive. Jurors were told to interrogate those limits, but the state's answer never left the latter. Phone silence to camera window to retail timestamp to burial corridor, confirmed later by Oklahoma authorities. It wasn't a single bright point. It was overlapping shadows forming a recognizable outline. Within minutes of receiving instructions, the panel asked for the timeline exhibits again, then the sector map, then the retail log. They studied what the law allowed them to consider and returned to their seats. The verdict, capital murder of multiple persons, arrived after measured deliberation. In the punishment phase, the jurors considered special issues and heard the defendant's direct address. They weighed aggravating and mitigating evidence. The sentence, death, was read in open court, recorded by the clerk, and followed by the automatic appellate path reserved for the state's most serious punishment. That path is slow by design. It favors accuracy over speed, record over rumor. As of September 7, 2025, the conviction and sentence stand, with direct review and post-conviction litigation moving through the ordinary channels. That status line is not theater, it is a guardrail. It tells victim families they can trust what the record says today and assures the public that if the law demands a correction tomorrow, there is a lawful way to make it. In towns like Temple and Belton, murders aren't just crimes. They bend family trees and school rosters and church rows. The only answer a system can offer is careful work that doesn't break under appeal. It's tempting to look for a motive paragraph to tie this together. The disciplined answer is to resist. The jury's job wasn't to debate philosophy, it was to decide identity, act, and the aggravating circumstance using admissible proof. The work you've heard, body as scene findings, clock-corrected cameras, carrier logs, retail records, vehicle processing, and corroborated statements, carried that burden. There's meaning in that restraint. It protects future cases. It honors two lives by refusing to dilute them with conjecture. If you take anything practical from this story, let it be that patterns matter. Escalating control, isolation, and the reach of an angry ex are red flags that friends, families, and courts must treat as urgent. Early documentation, screenshots, doorbell clips, receipt photos, may feel small in real time, but later they become anchors that keep the truth from drifting. That's not abstract advice. It's the difference between a rumor and a record when the worst happens. The file closes here with one, and only one, outcome stated for the record. Appeals continue, but the judgment is fixed unless the law says otherwise. That is how a community begins to heal, by knowing what happened and how we know it. Guilty. Sentenced to death. June 9, 2023. When I look back at this crime and the path it took through our courts, one lesson stands out. Justice is never automatic. It's built piece by piece through persistence, records, and the courage of those who refuse to stay silent. For families, the pain of loss is permanent, but truth at least offers clarity. I want to ask you, what safeguards do you believe could prevent tragedies like this in your own community? Share your thoughts below. And if this story touched you, let me know where you're watching from or why you connected with it. If you want to follow more true stories like this, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next.